Okay, so last week we began a discussion about Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and really it's really a two-parter conceptually. We began the first part last week, which is basically the history of it. How did it evolve? How did it come to such a thing where we have Klal Yisrael divided in two parts, Sephardim and Ashkenazim? And again, even within Ashkenazim there are differences, and within Sephardim there are differences. So after we go through the history of it, which I hope to finish this week, we'll then go into the next part, which is in Pnimius, which is the real part they don't teach in yeshiva, about what is in the workings of the neshama, what's the difference between an Ashkenazi neshama and a Sephardi neshama in our level. And the more we'll understand the differences between them as far as the souls are concerned, the more we'll see about, how things that are happening nowadays as we get closer to Mashiach, fascinating things that are taking place. So last week what we discussed basically was sort of the groundwork or the foundation of where the split between Ashkenazim and Sephardim began. And we discussed last time how, in the beginning, historically, when we were centralized in Eretz Yisrael during the times of the Beis Hamikdash and after the Beis Hamikdash a little bit, and then when we were centralized as far as Torah is concerned, we were centralized in Bavel and Iraq. So as I said, even though there were communities, small communities, sprouting up all over the place, but once the Jewish people were centralized as far as the yeshivas were concerned in Eretz Yisrael or in Bavel, so there was basically one approach to learning. Any shiloh that was too difficult for a specific Rav to handle in their far-flung community, they would send it to the yeshiva in Bavel and they would get the answer. So all of Torah, all of learning was basically centralized to Bavel, and all halacha was centralized to Bavel. But as we said last time, around the year 1000 or so, or maybe even 900, when the community of Bavel began to fall apart, and the center of learning was unable to be maintained in just Bavel, so there was a need for independent yeshivas to develop and thrive in other places in the world. So as we mentioned last time, that Hashem sent the four captives sort of as a prelude to what was going to be taking place with the destruction of the community of Bavel, and we had different communities within Europe and within North Africa and the Middle East and so on, developed yeshivas and schools developed in those areas on their own with distinct styles of understanding, with the distinct personality traits. As different people from different countries think differently and act differently. So we talked about this last time, how basically during the time period of, let's call it from the 1000s to about the 1400s, there developed many different schools. So you had the school of Ashkenaz, which was in Germany and northern France, and you had the school of Egypt, which is by the Rambam, and then you had the school of of Spain, of the Ramban and the Rajva and so on. And this is what we talked about. And we mentioned last time at the end that during this entire time period, so there was minimal travel, minimal communication between these different countries, and therefore, if you were an Ashkenazi Jew living in Germany, then that's what you did. You followed the approach of the school of Rashi and the school of Tosfos and so on, and any shal that came up was able to be handled by the Rav in your community, and that's it. And it didn't bother you, and you barely ever heard of the Jew, of how they were living in Spain. It didn't really have anything to do with you, and therefore each community sort of existed on its own, independent of the other communities, and that's how these schools developed and thrived. And this was taking place again from the year 1000 to the year 1400. At the end of the 1400s, something took place that for whatever reason, it's not for now, it's a little bit beyond what we're talking about right now, the political structure of these countries began to change. And no longer were these countries, again, towards the end of the 1400s, no longer were these countries isolated. There was a lot more communications and a lot more traveling that was taking place from Europe to Asia and Africa. There was a lot of more communications and so on. This added level of communication, especially the expulsion of the Jewish people from Spain, which basically forced that entire school and entire community to go elsewhere and to spread and to and to sort of enter into other communities and other territories. So there was a little bit of a feeling at this point in time, towards the end of the 1400s, that you have two neighbors are acting differently. One neighbor is an Ashkenazi and his neighbor is a Sephardi from Spain, and it got a little bit confusing. So a major turning point in Jewish history as far as Torah is concerned took place basically in the beginning of the 1500s, which was the work of the Shulchan Aruch, the writing of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch was written, again, I don't remember the exact dates offhand. I didn't have a chance to look it up. But again, it's the beginning of the 1500s. It was written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who himself was of Sephardic descent. He eventually made his way to Tzfat in Eretz Yisrael, and he wrote his major work is the Beis Yosef, and eventually he wrote the Shulchan Aruch. Now, what was the Shulchan Aruch? The Shulchan Aruch, again, if you don't know, the Shulchan Aruch is the code of Jewish law. You want to know what to do when you wake up in the morning. You want to know what to do on Shabbos. So you look in Shulchan Aruch. What Rabbi Yosef Karo did was to solve the problem. Again, the problem that he had and he saw was that no longer were, like I said, no longer were the communities isolated. And because of that, it was necessary to sort of create a handbook that everyone would be able to have and everyone will be able to look up and to deal with on their own. Again, this didn't mean to take away from the role of the rabbi. And in fact, there were contemporaries of Rabbi Yosef Karo that were against the Shulchan Aruch's printing because they were afraid it would remove authority from rabbis. But the purpose was, again, as far as Rabbi Yosef Karo was concerned, was not to take away the authority from rabbis, but it was to give an even playing field for everyone, that everyone at least should have a guidebook of what it means to be a Jew halachically. How does a Jew live halachically? And again, anything that's more complicated and not explicit in the Shulchan Aruch, then you go to your local Orthodox rabbi and so on. But there should be one basic work for everyone. And again, this was necessary at this time where communities started to mingle and there was a lot of confusion as to how a Jew is supposed to live halachically. Again, like I said, before this time, it wasn't so confusing. Every community was sort of on their own. So Rabbi Yosef Karo set out to create this, again, one magnum opus, this one work that would unify all of the Jewish people under one umbrella, under one guide of halacha. Now, what was his approach? How did Rabbi Yosef Karo decide to deal with all the different schools? Because again, you can't just ignore them. You have to be able, again, his point was to take all the schools and sort of unify them all and to give the Jewish people one unified book of halacha that contains within it the bottom line from all the different schools. So how did he do it? So Rabbi Yosef Karo, in his introduction to Beis Yosef, writes the following thing. It's a fascinating thing. Rabbi Yosef Karo said that as far as halacha is concerned, obviously every school developed their own rabbis, and every one of the Rishonim from the earlier years are considered exceptionally great people. But as far as the standard of halacha is concerned, Rabbi Yosef Karo personally felt, and this is his tradition from his Rabbanim, that there are three pillars, what he calls them. There are three pillars of halacha. There's the Rambam. The Rambam is one pillar of halacha, whose words carry a tremendous amount of weight as far as halacha is concerned. Pillar number two is the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak al-Fasi, who was a little bit before the times of the Rambam. He lived in North Africa. That's pillar number two in halacha, whose words also carry a tremendous amount of weight. Pillar number three is the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, who was the chief rabbi. We talked about him last time, the chief rabbi of Ashkenaz. So those are the three pillars of halacha. So therefore, said the Beis Yosef, said Rabbi Yosef Karo, if I'm going to create a body of work of halacha that is going to be for all Jews, then this is my approach. I'm going to take the words of these three pillars of halacha, and whenever they disagree with each other, I'm going to go based on majority, and I'm going to go with 2 out of the 3. That was his approach. 2 out of the 3 pillars. If you have a situation where one of the pillars doesn't say his opinion, and all you have is conflict between 2 of the pillars, so now what do? Then, said Rabbi Yosef Karo, what I'll do is then I'll take into account the opinions of the lesser Rishonim, of the Ramban, the Rajba. It's hard to say the word lesser, but as far compared to these 3 pillars, I'll take into account, says Rabbi Yosef Karo, the opinion of the rest of the schools, the majority of the other schools, and then we'll go with the majority. That was Rabbi Yosef Karo's approach. And therefore, Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote his Shulchan Aruch in such a way where every halacha that he writes in Shulchan Aruch, there are a few exceptions, but more often than not, 95% of Shulchan Aruch are halachas that were agreed upon by at least 2 out of the 3 pillars. That was the approach of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and he felt that writing such a work would satisfy the entire Jewish people, and this would be a way to unify the Jewish people in halacha, and all Jews can follow this one approach. That was Rabbi Yosef Karo's intention. Now, the problem with this approach was raised by colleagues of Rabbi Yosef Karo, who happened to be of Ashkenazic descent. The problem was as follows. The 3 pillars that he chose to use, which again was the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh, the problem is that 99% of the time the Rambam and the Rif agree. The reason for that is because the Rambam was in Egypt, the Rif was in North Africa, and their schools were very similar. So because of that, more often than not, the Rif and the Rambam agree. And it's the Rosh, who's the chief rabbi of the Ashkenazic Jewry, who's left out in the cult as being the singular one. And therefore, it's not that the Beis Yosef gave more of authority to Sephardic Rishonim. It's just that in his model of having these three pillars of halacha, it turns out that more often than not, the vast majority of times, you would be following the Sephardic Rishonim of the Rambam, who's in Egypt, and the Rif, who's in North Africa, and you'll be ignoring the opinion of the Rosh, who was the chief rabbi of Ashkenaz. So this problem was raised by a colleague of Rabbi Yosef Karo, Ramosha Isserles, who was who was a contemporary of Yosef Karo, who lived in Europe. He lived in Poland. And the truth is, he himself wrote that at the same time that Rabbi Yosef Karo was working on his Shulchan Aruch, he was also working on a version of the Shulchan Aruch. And once he saw Rabbi Yosef Karo's printed version came out, because it came out before he was able to complete his work, he decided that Rabbi Yosef Karo's job was so phenomenal that, you know what, I'm not going to try to copy it. I'm not going to try to compete with it. But what I will do is that I will, with his permission, and he got permission from Rabbi Yosef Karo. There was a lot of communications between the two of them. They were good friends. What he did was he had the following critique. Again, his problem was that using the model of Rabbi Yosef Karo, you're basically practically going to ignore, in the vast majority of cases, Ashkenazic opinion. Ashkenazic opinion, which always followed Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh. So therefore, Ramosha Isserles, his personal approach with determining halacha was not to have this concept of the three pillars and you go with the majority. His opinion in general was to go with the more later opinions. The later opinions, who we assume saw the earlier opinions, they're the ones that we should follow practically. And therefore, as far as the Ramosha Isserles, that's how he's called, as far as the Ramah was concerned, the way to follow halacha, the way to determine halacha would be to take into account the Rosh and to take into account the later Rishonim of Ashkenaz. Because in Ashkenaz, there are more later Rishonim than there were in Sfard, for whatever reason. And because of that, this is how the divide became. Where, in other words, where Moshe Isserles, what he did was that within the printed Shulchan Aruch, he would make certain notes, and whenever an occasion came up where Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote a halacha based on the two of the three pillars, ignoring the opinion of the Rosh and all the Ashkenazic authorities, the Ramah would add in his 2 cents that our custom for Ashkenazim is this and this, or there are those that disagree, and so on. And that's why when a person learns Shulchan Aruch with its sources, again, 95% of any disagreements between Rabbi Yosef Karo and the Ramah and Ramosha Isserles boils down to this point. The Rabbi Yosef Karo was going to follow the Rambam and the Rif and ignore the opinion of the Rosh, and the Ramosha Isserles is more often than not going to accept the opinion of the Rosh and the more later Ashkenazic authorities. Now, therefore, this is what really drove the wedge, not in a negative way, but just practically, between Ashkenazic Jewry and Sephardic Jewry. Sephardic Jewry saw Rabbi Yosef Karo's method of determining halacha as valid, and therefore, practically speaking, all Sephardic Jewry accepted the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Karo, or at least his general approach to halacha, and Ashkenazic Jewry continued to follow their tradition, as was expressed by Ramosha Isserles, not to ignore the Ashkenazic authorities, but rather to go with the Ashkenazic authorities. And again, if there's no conflict between all Ashkenazic and Sephardic authorities, then obviously everyone's doing the same thing. We all wear tefillin, you know what I mean? But when there are conflicts, then this was the basic distinction between Moshe Isserles and Rabbi Yosef Karo. Now, again, this doesn't mean that after the Shulchan Aruch was written, all Sfardim always, forever, follow just the words of Rabbi Yosef Karo. That's also not so true. The basic model is followed by Rabbi Yosef Karo, but there are occasions, there are situations which come up when a person learns Shulchan Aruch thoroughly. There are occasions that come up where Rabbi Yosef Karo maybe, is coming from a certain understanding in the Rambam, and one can disagree with the way he understood the words of the Rambam, and things like that, nitty-gritty details within the basic approach. But the model of Rabbi Yosef Karo was something that generally was accepted by the Sephardic world, and the model of the Ramah was accepted by the Ashkenazic world. Like I mentioned, though, when the Shulchan Aruch was printed, so it was printed with the additions, with the notes of Ramosha Isserles. And there was a lot of communication that took place between Ramosha Isserles in Poland and Rabbi Yosef Karo in Israel. And again, like I said, there was no negative feelings between the two of them. They understood each other's approach, and they disagreed as far as method is concerned, but they respected each other. There were those, and I just hinted to this before, there were those that disagreed with the whole idea of printing a Shulchan Aruch in general. Famously, this was the opinion of the Maharshal, Rav Shlomo Luria, who was again a contemporary of the Rebbe of Cairo and Rav Moshe Isserles, he in Poland as well. He didn't like the whole idea of a Shulchan Aruch. He felt that again, practically, it might take away the authority of rabbis, and it might make laymen feel more educated than maybe they are. And he was afraid that if a person just has a Shulchan Aruch, then they'll, on their own, without knowing the sources, go, try to, determine new cases based on something that they saw in the Shulchan Aruch without knowing the sources, and which is obviously a dangerous thing. And that was, therefore, his approach was to ignore. He didn't like the whole Shulchan Aruch to begin with. But again, like I said, the vast majority of rabbis, and to this day for sure, the Shulchan Aruch was an unbelievable thing, and it helped unify the Jewish people, even though at the same time it did divide the Jewish people in half. And this is historically how something shifted from that time period called Rishonim between the 1000s and 1400s to after that time period. Again, during that time period of 1000 to 1400, there wasn't like two groups of Jews, Ashkenazim and Sephardim. There was all sorts of groups. There was Ashkenazim, there was provincial Jews in southern France, there was Egyptians, there was Spanish, there was Moroccan, all different schools on their own. Once Rabbi Yosef Karo came on the scene and developed this way of this approach, and Rav Moshe Isserles developed for Ashkenazic Jewry, it unified to a certain extent the Jewish people, but it also divided the Jewish people sort of in half. And you have Ashkenazim on one side, and now what we call Sephardim on the other. Even though technically Sephardim means Spain and Ashkenaz means Germany, but again, that's the umbrella term for these two groups of Jews. And ever since that point in time where the Shulchan Aruch was created, that became sort of the standard or the building block for future generations as far as halacha is concerned. And there's no question, like I mentioned, there are occasions where poskim, very often, where poskim will disagree. Sephardi poskim will disagree with wording, with a halachic ruling of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and Ashkenazic Rabbanim will disagree with a ruling of Rav Moshe Isserles. But that was the basic foundation. As far as, if you want to be safe, there's no question you could follow the Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Yosef Karo for Sephardim and the Ashkenazim, you follow the Ramah. Again, it still led room for there to be debates amongst rabbis and room for there to be disagreements and so on. And there's still room. There was room for different schools to develop. But again, once there was this unification of the Shulchan Aruch, now the differences are going to be even more subtle. And this is how halacha goes. Halacha it expands, and then someone comes at some point to pull it all together again, and then it expands more, and someone comes to pull it all together again. And so, for example, even after the Shulchan Aruch was printed, so for the next few hundred years, a number of hundreds of years, you had different rabbis again developing as well, using the Shulchan Aruch as a foundation, but then using that as a springboard to go off and develop their own concepts and so on. To the point of where even on Shulchan Aruch, if you open up a Shulchan Aruch, there's so many different commentaries on the page itself, in the back, other svarim and so on. And then you had people come to reunify halacha. So you had the Chavetz Chaim try to do that with the Mishnah Berurah, where again he's using the Shulchan Aruch as the model, and what he does is unify all the post Shulchan Aruch rabbis to unify their words, and he has his way of determining who to go with as far as the post Shulchan Aruch rabbis. And you had the Aruch HaShulchan, who was a Rav in Russia, the same concept he did as well. And you had, even very recently, you had Ravad Yosef for the Sephardim, sort of unify post Shulchan Aruch works for the Sephardim. This is the way halacha goes. But again, this is as far as historically is concerned. This was the evolution, you would say, between how did it happen where you had this divide between the Jewish people of Ashkenazim and Sephardim. And the next step in our discussion is going to be that, we have to believe in all levels of Torah. It's not just a question of, if you go through this and you see the history of the Jewish people and how this developed of Sephardim and Ashkenazim, so you have to then ask the next question on the deeper level is on the level of the neshama, how did this happen? Why is this happening? We know historically because this is how it evolved practically. But in the level of pnimius, in the level of the neshama, what is the core difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim that difference manifests itself in such a way where the Jewish people are divided in these two camps? And is there a milah of one over the other? Is one type of neshama stronger than the other? What are each neshama's personal strengths? Is there a certain style of learning? And is there a certain style of serving Hashem which is more natural to an Ashkenazi? and is there another certain style of learning and service of Hashem which is more natural to a Sephardi? These are things that we're going to be talking about hopefully in the next shiurim or two. But again, as of right now, that's just the simple history of what took place. And that's why when a person learns Shulchan Aruch, it's very important to have this background before you open it up, because otherwise you're just reading the words and you don't know where it's coming from. But this is the history of where it's coming from. When a person learns Shulchan Aruch properly, so you're able to go back to the sources and you'll see how from the different schools of the Rishonim, how it all funnels into what the Shulchan Aruch wrote and what Rabbi Yosef Moshe Isserles, put a certain footnote, maybe to disagree on certain occasions. Again, that's the history of Sfard and Ashkenaz, and next week we'll continue on to the next level. Again, if there's any questions, please feel free.
Right.
Okay?
Thank you.
Very good. Yashikayach, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure.
Take it easy.